Picture a garage in late 1987. In the center sits a machine that looks less like a car and more like a fortress carved from granite. This is the BMW 7 Series E32. It has 12 cylinders under the hood and a fax machine in the back seat, years before the internet would connect them. It was designed with a single, arrogant purpose: to last forever. But looking back, we see the irony. This specific machine marks the exact moment the automotive world changed. It is where we traded mechanical permanence for processing power. To understand why this car exists, we have to look at where BMW stood in the mid-1980s. They were successful, certainly, but they lived in a long, cold shadow cast by the Mercedes-Benz S-Class. The S-Class was not just a car. It was the default choice for heads of state and captains of industry. BM was the sporty alternative for the person who wanted to drive fast, but they were not the king. They wanted the throne. The development of the E32 was almost complete when a man named Wolfgang Reitzel stepped in. He looked at the prototype and made a decision that would terrify a modern accountant. He stopped everything. He realized that to beat Mercedes, they could not just match them, they had to crush them. He demanded a V12 engine, something no German car maker had built since World War II. The V12 was the nuclear option in the luxury wars. It was smooth and silent and excessively powerful. But fitting it was a logistical nightmare because the engine bay was too narrow. Most companies would have scrapped the engine, but Reitzel scrapped the car's dimensions instead. He convinced the board to delay the launch by a full year. He spent 300 million Deutsche Marks just to widen the car by 40 millimeters and modify the front end. In today's world of cost-cutting and platform sharing, this sounds like madness. In 1986, it was a statement of intent. This era of German manufacturing was unique. It was a brief window where the engineers held more power than the finance department. When you look at an E32 today, you are looking at the result of a cost, no object philosophy. The sheer amount of steel used in the unibody construction is staggering. It was designed for the Autobahn and for sustained speeds of 150 miles per hour without vibration or stress. If you drove an American luxury car from this time, like a Cadillac or a Lincoln, it floated down the road. The steering was vague, like piloting a boat. You felt disconnected from the pavement. The BMW was the opposite. It was heavy, yes, but it was dense. It felt planted. The steering had weight. The suspension communicated the texture of the road without punishing your spine. It was a driver's car disguised as a limousine. The rigid structure meant the car did not rattle and it did not flex. When you closed the door, it did not clang. It thudded with a sound that implied safety and wealth. This was the weapon BMW sharpened to kill the Mercedes S-Class. They built the ultimate mechanical object. But hidden deep within that V12 architecture was a redundancy feature that would eventually turn into a nightmare for owners 30 years later. A feature that proves even the best engineering can have unintended consequences. To understand why, we first need to look at how they tried to invent the future. Stepping inside the cabin reveals the true philosophy of the era. The first thing that registers is the smell. It is a distinct, heavy scent of horsehair padding and thick, untreated leather. This was before the industry obsessed over vegan alternatives or weight-saving synthetics. The leather in an E32 feels substantial. It has a deep grain that feels real against the fingertips. It was not stretched thin over plastic foam to save a few pennies. It was draped over heavy frames designed to support a driver for 6 hours on the Autobahn without a single ache. Every interaction with the controls feels deliberate. Reach for the headlight switch on the dashboard. It is a chunky rotary dial that clicks into position with the satisfying weight of a safe crackers tumbler. Press a button on the center console to lower the window. It does not merely tap, it travels. There is a mechanical resistance that pushes back against the finger before snapping down. This was intentional. BMW engineers measured the exact Newton force required to make a switch feel expensive. They understood that luxury is not just what is seen, but what is felt. Even the ashtrays glide open with a damped hydraulic smoothness that suggests they were engineered with the same care as the transmission. Under the hood of the base models sat the M30 inline-6 engine. This piece of engineering is the definition of bulletproof. By the time it reached the E32 chassis, it had been refined for decades. It used a cast-iron block that could likely survive a direct mortar strike. It stands in stark contrast to the fragile aluminum and magnesium alloys common today. Enthusiasts often call it the anvil. It is not the most powerful engine in the world, but it possesses a mechanical integrity that is almost extinct. It was an engine built with tolerances that assumed the owner intended to keep the car for 20 years rather than just a 3-year lease. The suspension followed the same philosophy of absolute substance. Looking under a modern luxury car reveals stamped steel or intricate aluminum webbing designed to shave grams. Under the E32, one finds heavy, forged steel control arms. The components look agricultural in their size. They were built to handle the mass of the car and the forces of high-speed driving without complaining. This created a ride quality that is hard to find in the modern era. The E32 used physics rather than software. The sheer weight of the car settled the suspension, while the geometry kept the tires flat. It floated, but it never wallowed. The texture of the asphalt was communicated through the steering wheel, but the impact of a pothole never reached the spine. Then came the silence. In 1991, BMW introduced double-pane glass to the 7 Series. This was not just for insulation, it was a statement. The windows were essentially 2 sheets of glass with a vacuum-sealed air gap in between. It added significant weight to the doors, which explains that heavy closing sound, but the effect inside was profound. It turned the cabin into a sensory deprivation tank. You could be driving at 100 miles per hour and speak in a whisper. The wind noise that plagued other cars simply did not exist here. It created a sense of isolation that made the outside world feel like a silent movie playing through the windows. Open the trunk and look at the underside of the lid. There is a drop-down tray containing a full toolkit, real metal wrenches, a screwdriver with a reversible head, pliers. It was a subtle signal to the owner. It said that this machine was built to be understood and maintained. It treated the driver as a partner in the mechanical operation of the vehicle. This car represents the absolute peak of analog engineering. It was the final time that mechanical solutions were the primary answer to luxury problems. If a quieter car was required, they added thicker glass. If a smoother ride was needed, they used heavier steel. It was a philosophy of tangible substance. You can feel the money spent on the engineering in every heavy component, but that vault-like silence was designed to hide more than just wind noise. It was masking a specific mechanical sound that BMW engineers were terrified the public would hear, a sound that would eventually signal the end of an engine's life. But before we get to that failure, we have to look at the moment BMW decided to leave the safety of steel and iron to embrace the silicon chip. The crown jewel of this technological push was the engine. When BMW decided to build the 750iL, they did not just want power, they wanted supremacy. The result was the M60. It was the first 12-cylinder engine to be fitted to a German passenger car since the Second World War. That fact alone was a message to the world that Germany had fully recovered and was ready to lead again. It was an all-aluminum masterpiece, not designed for the screaming speed of a racetrack, but for a crushing, effortless momentum. It was so smooth that engineers demonstrated it by balancing a coin on the intake manifold. They started the engine, and the coin remained standing on its edge. It was a level of refinement that made the internal combustion engine feel almost electric. But to achieve this perfection, BMW had to sever the physical link between the driver and the machine. This was the birth of the electronic throttle known as EML. When you press the gas pedal in the V12, you were not pulling a steel cable connected to the engine. You were sending a digital request to a computer. The computer would analyze the request, check the traction levels, and then decide how much power to actually grant you. Because the V12 was essentially two 6-cylinder engines joined at the crankcase, it required two separate engine control units. One computer ran the left bank of cylinders, and another ran the right. They had to talk to each other constantly to keep the engine in perfect harmony. It was a technological marvel, but it was also the first step away from the mechanical simplicity we had just admired. The driver was no longer the commander. He was merely making suggestions to the software. The ambition did not stop at the engine. If you ordered the Highline version of the 750iL, you were effectively buying a private jet for the road. This trim level represents the absolute peak of the 1980s excess. In the back seat, you could find a refrigerator powered by its own cooling unit. There was independent climate control for rear passengers. But the ultimate status symbol was the fax machine. Picture the entrepreneur of the late 80s cruising the Autobahn at 140 miles per hour, receiving a contract via fax in the back seat. To power all of this, the car required a second alternator and a second battery in the trunk. It was a rolling office that consumed electricity as voraciously as it consumed fuel. The Highline options alone cost as much as a standard family car, doubling the price of the base model. Underneath the car, the innovation was just as radical. This was the debut of electronic damper control. With the push of a button, the driver could stiffen the shock absorbers for a mountain road or soften them for the highway. Today, this is common. In 1987, it was science fiction. They also added traction control. The car could sense when a wheel was spinning on wet pavement and cut power faster than a human could react. These systems were designed to keep the driver safe and comfortable, but they added layers of sensors and actuators that had never existed before. This is where the story gets complicated. To make all of this work, the wiring harness of the E32 grew into something that resembled a nervous system. It was miles of copper wire snaking through the chassis. It was no longer a simple electrical circuit where a switch turned on a light. It was a network of modules talking to other modules. The seat memory had to talk to the mirrors. The transmission had to talk to the engine. The suspension had to talk to the brakes. The dashboard featured a matrix display that could check the status of bulbs and fluids, alerting the driver to problems before they happened. BMW was looking at the dashboard of the future, confident that their electronic fortress was impregnable, but while they were obsessing over fax machines and damper solenoids, a rival across the Pacific was preparing a demonstration involving a pyramid of champagne glasses that would make the E32 look like an overpriced relic overnight. They were about to learn that technology moves faster than steel. The threat arrived in 1989, and it wore a Toyota badge disguised in a tuxedo. When the Lexus LS 400 landed on American and European shores, it did not just compete, it humiliated. The Japanese engineers had reverse-engineered the German luxury sedan and found a way to replicate the silence and the smoothness for roughly 30% less money. They ran commercials showing a pyramid of champagne glasses stacked on the hood of the car while the engine ran at full throttle on a dynamometer. The glasses did not move. It was the same trick BMW used to sell the V12, but Lexus was doing it with a V8 for the price of a base model BMW. This external shock was compounded by a financial crisis that had nothing to do with engineering. The German mark was skyrocketing in value against the dollar. This currency fluctuation forced BMW to push the price of the 7 Series into the stratosphere. Suddenly, the base model 735i cost significantly more than the fully loaded Lexus. Buyers who had been loyal to the Bavarian flag began to do the math. The gap between the 6-cylinder model and the 12-cylinder flagship was simply too wide. There was a chasm in the middle of the lineup where the volume buyers lived, and BMW was losing them to a newcomer from the East. Stuttgart and Munich had to respond. For BMW, the answer arrived in 1992. They realized that the old iron block inline 6, the anvil we admired earlier, was no longer enough. It was durable, yes, but it was heavy, and it was old technology. To fight Lexus, they needed a modern V8. This was the birth of the M60 engine family. It was a clean sheet design that marked a significant departure from the heavy metal philosophy of the 1980s. The engineers moved away from cast iron blocks and embraced aluminum. They replaced the single overhead cam with dual overhead cams and 32 valves. The new V8 was a marvel of efficiency. It was physically larger than the old 6-cylinder, but it weighed less. It produced almost as much power as the massive V12, but consumed far less fuel. When you drove a 740i equipped with this new engine, the character of the car transformed. The heavy nose that defined the V12 models disappeared. The car felt lighter on its feet. It turned into corners with a crispness that the heavy flagship could not match. It was the perfect compromise. It offered the torque and the sound of a V8 with the handling balance of a sports sedan. Transformed without sacrifice. Look closer at the engine bay of a 1992 model and you see the influence of the Japanese competition. The over-engineering began to change shape. Instead of heavy steel brackets and overbuilt castings, the focus shifted to advanced coatings and weight-saving measures. They used plastic for the intake manifolds to smooth airflow and reduce mass. They used magnesium for the valve covers. They were chasing the efficiency metrics that Lexus had established. The goal was no longer just durability at any cost. The goal was refinement and performance per liter. The M60 V8 was intended to be the weapon that would drive the Japanese back into the sea. It was lighter, faster, and more advanced than anything in the class. It seemed like the perfect engineering response to a changing market. But in their rush to innovate, and in their pursuit of the ultimate lightweight material science, the engineers made a critical assumption. They assumed that fuel quality around the world was as high as it was in Germany. They bet the reputation of the brand on a specific cylinder coating called Nikasil. That bet went catastrophically wrong. The engineering brilliance of the new V8 was undeniable, but it walked hand in hand with a disaster that nearly ruined BMW's reputation in North America. The culprit was Nikasil. This was a hyper-advanced nickel silicon carbide coating used to line the cylinder walls. It was harder than steel, and it had been proven in Formula One racing. On the test benches in Munich, where fuel quality was strictly controlled, it worked perfectly. But in the real world, specifically in the United States and the United Kingdom, the fuel contained high levels of sulfur. The sulfur did not burn cleanly. Instead, it reacted chemically with the nickel lining. Slowly and invisibly, the cylinder walls began to dissolve. The engines lost compression. A V8 that had been designed to be the smoothest engine in the world began to idle like a tractor. It would stall at traffic lights. Owners who had paid a fortune for the ultimate driving machine found themselves in cars that shook violently while waiting for the light to turn green. BMW eventually did the honorable thing and replaced thousands of engine blocks under warranty, switching to a material called alusil that was immune to the sulfur. But the damage was done. The E32 had proven that sometimes being on the cutting edge means you are the first to bleed. However, while the engineers were scrambling to fix the melting engine blocks, a much smaller invisible enemy was already nesting inside the dashboard, one that no warranty could ever truly fix. The longer-lasting tragedy of the E32 lies in its electronics. This car was built right at the dawn of the digital age, which means it relies on computer hardware that was never designed to last 30 years. The capacitors inside the engine control units are the primary enemy. These small components, which cost pennies, are responsible for regulating power on the circuit boards. Over time, they degrade and leak electrolytic fluid. This fluid is corrosive. It eats through the copper traces on the circuit board, effectively giving the car's brain a lobotomy. The result is a machine that is mechanically perfect but digitally senile. You might find a low-mileage example where the leather is pristine and the paint is flawless. But when you turn the key, the dashboard lights up like a Christmas tree of warnings. The distinct orange pixels on the instrument cluster, which display the mileage and the check control messages, begin to die one by one. You end up driving a car where you have to guess the odometer reading because half the numbers have faded into darkness. The contrast between the mechanical and the electrical is heartbreaking. The automatic transmissions built by ZF are incredibly robust, often capable of covering 300,000 miles with basic fluid changes. The rear differential is virtually indestructible, but the module that controls the memory seats will fail, leaving you unable to adjust your driving position. The climate control system uses a massive resistor pack known as the Sword, located deep behind the dashboard. When it fails, the fan will only run at full blast or not at all. You have a car that can cruise at 150 miles per hour, but you cannot control the temperature inside it. Then there is the infamous shimmy. This is a mechanical quirk that plagues almost every surviving E32. At exactly 55 miles per hour, the steering wheel will often begin to oscillate violently in the driver's hands. This is not a defect in the steering box, but a consequence of the car's heavy engineering. The massive front control arms rely on rubber bushings to absorb the road. Because the front end of the car is so heavy, especially on the V12 models, these rubber bushings surrender to the stress. They wear out and create a harmonic resonance that shakes the entire front suspension. It is a fixable problem, but it terrifies new owners who think the wheels are about to fall off. The maintenance reality of the E32 today is a paradox. It is a car that is mechanically willing to drive to the moon. The pistons, the valves, and the gears are solid, but it is electronically convinced that it cannot leave the driveway. The most feared message on the dashboard is transprogram. It indicates a transmission failure and forces the car into a safety mode where it is stuck in third gear. In reality, the transmission is usually fine. The error is often caused by a voltage drop from a weak battery or a dirty sensor. The computer senses a ghost and shuts down the machine. It is the ultimate frustration of the modern classic era. You are not fighting rust or mechanical wear. You are fighting the logic of a 30-year-old computer that has decided it is unsafe to drive. Yet despite these headaches, there is a reason people keep saving them. They represent a specific sweet spot in history that was lost the moment the next generation arrived. This brings us to a curious reality. By all logic, the E32 7 Series should be extinct. It is a heavy, fuel-hungry luxury sedan with expensive parts sets and a level of complexity that scares away the average mechanic. Yet if you look at the classifieds or attend a German car show, you will see them. They are still here, often in better condition than cars half their age. Why does this specific dinosaur survive when so many of its contemporaries like the Audi V8 or the Jaguar XJ40 have been crushed into cubes? Part of the answer lies in the demographics of nostalgia. The people who were teenagers in 1987 are now in their 50s and 60s. They remember the poster of the 750iL on their bedroom wall. They remember when this car was the ultimate symbol of success, a sign that you had not just made it, but that you own the road. Now that these reliable workhorses have depreciated into the realm of affordability, this generation is rescuing them. They are willing to tolerate the finicky electronics because the mechanical soul of the car is so rewarding. There is also a practical reason for its survival. The E32 sits on the very edge of the manageable. Compare it to the 7 Series that arrived in 2002, the E65. That car introduced the iDrive system and fiber optic wiring networks. If a module fails in an E65, it often requires proprietary software and dealer-level coding to fix. You cannot simply swap a part from a junkyard car because the central computer will reject it. The home mechanic is locked out. The E32 is different. It is complex, yes, but it is logical. You can still diagnose it with a multimeter and a wiring diagram. It does not hide its secrets behind encrypted software firewalls. Consider the model that followed it, the E38. It is widely regarded as one of the most beautiful sedans ever made. Yet even there we saw the creep of cost-cutting, with plastic timing chain guides that shatter and seal transmissions that claim to never need fluid changes. The E32 comes from a time before the concept of planned obsolescence had fully taken root. It was built with the assumption that it would be serviced, not discarded. Furthermore, it shares its DNA with the E34 series, which was produced in the millions. This means that suspension components, brake parts, and engine accessories are still widely available and relatively cheap. A flagship luxury car usually dies when its unique parts become unobtainable. The E32 survives because it shares its heart with the working class 5 Series, allowing it to remain on the road when others have faded. But the most compelling reason for its survival is the way it drives. We have grown used to modern luxury cars that isolate us completely from the act of driving. Modern electric power steering systems filter out everything. They are numb. They are video game controllers. The E32 uses a recirculating ball steering box with hydraulic assistance. It is heavy at low speeds. It requires effort to park. But at 60 miles per hour, it comes alive. You can feel the texture of the asphalt through the rim of the steering wheel. You can feel the front tires load up in a corner. It offers a sensation that has been engineered out of modern cars. It is the feeling of operating a machine rather than interacting with a computer. The suspension absorbs the bumps, but it does not erase the road. The throttle is linear. The brakes are firm. It reminds the driver that they are piloting 2 tons of German steel. This tactile connection is addictive. It is why an owner will spend thousands of dollars fixing a 30-year-old air conditioning system. They know that if they sell this car, they cannot buy this feeling again. New cars are faster, they are safer, they are more efficient, but they do not feel like this. The E32 is a rolling time capsule of a specific philosophy that valued feedback over isolation. The BMW E32 7 Series was the final handshake between the era of the master mechanic and the era of the computer technician. It was the last time a flagship sedan was built to be the best possible machine rather than the most profitable product. It stood on the precipice of the digital age, looking forward with optimism, but holding on to the mechanical integrity of the past. It was imperfect, expensive, and complicated, but it had a soul that the microchips eventually replaced. If you remember the era when luxury meant weight and substance, let us know your favorite detail in the comments below. Do not forget to subscribe for more automotive archaeology.